You're listening to The Observing Eye. Pirate radio for the mind. Coming at you fresh from the computer hell cabin.
Hello, you beautiful lot. It's Friday, the 26th of July, 2024, and you're listening to episode 75 of The Observing Eye, coming at you live from the computer hell cabin. Every week we get psychological, philosophical, and all manner of introspective. I'm David, and this week we are looking at cosmic horror and the psychology of H.P. Lovecraft. Imagine a world where the greatest horror is not the monster under your bed or the ghost in the attic, but the very universe itself, an indifferent cosmos where humans are insignificant, powerless against ancient, incomprehensible forces. This is the essence of cosmic horror, a genre masterfully crafted by the enigmatic writer H.P. Lovecraft. Lovecraft's tales are not just stories, they are a psychological exploration of fear, madness, and the unknown. Lovecraft's works, such as The Call of Cthulhu, At the Mountains of Madness, and The Shadow over Innsmouth, introduce us to a universe teeming with ancient godlike beings whose very existence challenges our understanding of reality. These entities, often referred to as the Great Old Ones, exist beyond our comprehension, their motives and nature unknowable. This theme of the unknowable is central to Lovecraft's cosmic horror, playing on the psychological fear of the unknown. But why, decades after Lovecraft's death, do his stories continue to captivate and terrify us? Part of the answer lies in the universality and timelessness of the themes he explores. In an age where scientific advancement continuously expands our understanding of the universe, Lovecraft's stories remind us of our limitations and the vast, uncaring cosmos that lies beyond our comprehension. His work resonates with our modern existential fears, tapping into the anxiety that comes with recognizing our tininess in an infinite universe. As we dive into this episode, we're going to explore Lovecraft's background, the psychological tools he used in his storytelling, and the enduring appeal of his work. Plus, there's a little taste of Lovecraft's storytelling towards the end. Join me today as we unravel both the fascinating and terrifying world of H.P. Lovecraft and the cosmic horror he so masterfully created. Understanding the background of Lovecraft is essential to appreciating the nuances of his cosmic horror. So we're going to journey back to the late 19th century, to the small but storied city of Providence, Rhode Island, where Howard Phillips Lovecraft was born on August 20th, 1890. H.P. Lovecraft's early years were marked by a combination of intellectual stimulation and personal tragedy, both of which profoundly influenced his writing. Lovecraft was the only child of Winfield Scott Lovecraft and Sarah Susan Phillips Lovecraft. His father, Winfield, was a traveling salesman, often away on business trips. When Lovecraft was just 3 years old, his father suffered a severe psychotic episode and was institutionalized at Butler Hospital, where he remained until his death in 1898. The exact cause of Winfield's illness is still debated, but it is widely believed to have been caused by untreated syphilis. Winfield had been playing away on his sales trips, clearly. The early loss had a profound impact on Lovecraft. With his father absent and eventually deceased, Lovecraft was raised by his mother Sarah and his maternal grandparents. Sarah, who was overprotective and emotionally unstable, often reinforced Lovecraft's feelings of isolation and difference from other children. Despite her affectionate, albeit controlling nature, Sarah's own mental health began to deteriorate, leading to her eventual commitment, again to Butler Hospital, in 1919, where she died 2 years later. Lovecraft's maternal grandmother, Whipple Van Buren Phillips, that's the name, Whipple, played a significant role in his upbringing. Whipple was a successful businessman. Did I say grandmother? Grandfather, sorry. Whipple was a successful businessman and a voracious reader, and his expansive library became young Howard's sanctuary. Here, Lovecraft discovered the works of classical authors, as well as scientific texts and ancient mythologies. This eclectic mix of literature would later influence the themes and style of Lovecraft's writing, blending the arcane with the scientific in his unique brand of horror. From a young age, Lovecraft displayed an extraordinary intellect. By the age of 3, he was already reading and writing. His early literary efforts included poetry and short stories inspired by Greek mythology and Gothic tales. Lovecraft was particularly influenced by the works of Edgar Allan Poe, whose macabre and atmospheric style would definitely echo in Lovecraft's own stories. However, Lovecraft's childhood was not without its difficulties, as if that wasn't difficult enough. He suffered from various health issues, both physical and psychological, which often kept him out of school. These illnesses, combined with his mother's overprotectiveness, led to a sheltered and isolated upbringing. Lovecraft's formal education was sporadic at best, but his autodidactic nature and insatiable curiosity drove him to educate himself through extensive reading and self-study. Despite his reclusive nature, Lovecraft found companionship in the literary world. He corresponded with other writers and intellectuals, forming a network of friendships that would last throughout his life. One of the most significant of these friendships was with Samuel Loveman, a poet and critic who introduced Lovecraft to a broader literary circle. Through these connections, Lovecraft began to publish his work in amateur press magazines, gaining a small but dedicated following. Lovecraft's early forays into professional writing were met with mixed success. His first published story, The Alchemist, appeared in the United Amateur in 1916. It showcased many of the themes that would become hallmarks of his later work: ancient curses, hidden knowledge, and the omnipresent spectre of death. However, it wasn't until the publication of The Call of Cthulhu in Weird Tales magazine in 1928 that Lovecraft truly began to make his mark on the world of horror fiction. The Call of Cthulhu introduced readers to the concept of cosmic horror, an existential dread rooted in the insignificance of humanity in the face of a vast, indifferent universe. This story, like much of Lovecraft's work, was inspired by his own philosophical and scientific interests. Lovecraft was a staunch materialist and atheist, skeptical of religion and human exceptionalism. He believed that the universe was fundamentally chaotic and indifferent to human existence, a perspective that clearly permeates his fiction. Lovecraft's writing during the 1920s and 30s explored these themes in increasingly complex and imaginative ways. Stories like At the Mountains of Madness, The Shadow over Innsmouth, and The Dunwich Horror delve into ancient hidden knowledge, forbidden rituals, and the monstrous entities that lurk just beyond the veil of human understanding. These tales are characterized by their richly detailed settings, meticulously crafted mythologies, and the ever-present sense of cosmic dread. Despite his literary achievements, Lovecraft struggled financially throughout his life. His works, though respected in certain literary circles, were not widely read or commercially successful during his lifetime. He often had to rely on ghostwriting and revisions of other authors' works to make ends meet. This financial instability, coupled with his reclusive nature and deteriorating health, created within him a sense of personal failure and despair. Lovecraft's later years were marked by increasing isolation and poverty. After the death of his mother, he briefly married Sonia Green, a writer and businesswoman, in 1924. The marriage was troubled from the start, largely due to Lovecraft's reluctance to leave Providence and his aversion to conventional employment. The couple separated amicably after 2 years, and Lovecraft returned to Providence, where he continued to write and correspond with his literary peers. In the 1930s, Lovecraft's health began to decline significantly. He suffered from malnutrition and was eventually diagnosed with cancer of the small intestine. Despite his illness, he continued to write, producing some of the most celebrated works during this period. His letters from this time reflect a deepening sense of pessimism and a preoccupation with mortality, which is probably understandable considering you've been diagnosed with a terminal illness. H.P. Lovecraft died on March 15th, 1937, at the age of 46. At the time of his death, he was virtually unknown outside of a small circle of dedicated readers and fellow writers. However, his literary legacy was far from over. In the years following his death, Lovecraft's work began to gain recognition and appreciation, thanks in a large part to the efforts of his friends and admirers who preserved and promoted his stories. Today, H.P. Lovecraft is recognized as one of the most influential writers of horror fiction in the 20th century. His creation of the Cthulhu mythos, a complex, interconnected universe of ancient gods, forbidden knowledge, and cosmic terror, has inspired countless authors, filmmakers, and artists. Lovecraft's influence can be seen in the works of Stephen King, Neil Gaiman, Guillermo del Toro, and many others. Lovecraft's personal philosophy and his literary output are inextricably linked. His materialist worldview, his fascination with the unknown, and his deep-seated sense of existential dread all find expression in his stories. Lovecraft's cosmic horror is not just about monsters and madness, it's about the human condition, our place in the universe, and the terrifying realization that we are not the masters of our fate. Stay with us as we journey further into the mind of H.P. Lovecraft and the chilling realms of cosmic horror. But first, a word from our sponsor. A few episodes ago, I mentioned that this podcast would never be sponsored because I felt that having a sponsor would impinge upon my freedom of expression and artistic and creative vision and all that kind of thing. And that has since changed, unfortunately. The podcast is now sponsored. I'm a terrible hypocrite, but the podcast is sponsored by me. So I feel that that's an acceptable sort of grey area in which to exist when it comes to contradicting oneself. Now, when I say I'm sponsoring this podcast, I am sponsoring it with my new book, which is called The Observing Eye, A Guide to Living a More Authentic Life. Now, it's available on paperback and on the Kindle via Amazon, exclusively on Amazon, because there's a Kindle Unlimited deal that I have to adhere to for 3 months. But you can find it on there. You can go and search The Observing Eye on Amazon, and I will put the link in the show notes or description as well, so you can find it there a little bit easier. So the book essentially is a complement to the podcast, and the purpose of the book is to give you some philosophical and psychological tools and ideas to challenge your own perception, your own self-narrative. It's all about storytelling, about how storytelling and narrative shape who we are and our identity, and how we can change that narrative. So it's definitely got a narrative therapy vibe to it, put it that way. And it's out now. It's been out for a few weeks. And if you'd like to go and purchase a copy, that would be wonderful. And I'd really appreciate it. So that's my sponsor window. There we are. My book is out. You can buy it on Amazon. Links in the description. Or you can just search The Observing Eye on Amazon as well. Thank you for your time, as always. Much love. And now back to the episode. In this section, we're going to explore the psychological tools and methodologies that Lovecraft employed in his storytelling. Lovecraft's work is not just about evoking fear. It's about tapping into the deepest, most primal aspects of the human psyche. So let's delve into the mechanics behind Lovecraft's unique brand of cosmic horror. Lovecraft's stories are renowned for their ability to instill a profound sense of dread and unease. This effect is achieved through a variety of psychological tools and storytelling techniques that work together to create an atmosphere of fear. At the heart of Lovecraft's horror is a central theme, the insignificance of humanity in the face of an indifferent universe. This concept, known as cosmic horror, is the foundation upon which Lovecraft builds his narratives. One of the most powerful tools that Lovecraft employs is the fear of the unknown. Unlike conventional horror that often reveals the monster or the source of terror, Lovecraft's horrors remain largely unseen and incomprehensible. This fear of the unknown taps into a fundamental aspect of human psychology. Our minds are wired to seek understanding and control over our environment. When confronted with the unknown or the unknowable, we experience a deep sense of unease and fear. In stories like The Color Out of Space and The Whisperer in Darkness, Lovecraft describes phenomena that defy human understanding. The titular color in The Color Out of Space is an alien presence that cannot be fully perceived or described using earthly terms. This inability to fully comprehend the nature of the threat enhances the horror as the reader is left to grapple with the unsettling notion that there are things in the universe that lie beyond human cognition. Another key psychological tool that Lovecraft uses is his meticulous creation of atmosphere. The settings in Lovecraft stories are almost characters in their own right, infused with a sense of foreboding and decay. Consider the ancient crumbling town of Innsmouth in The Shadow over Innsmouth, or the eerie, isolated landscape of the Antarctic in At the Mountains of Madness. These environments are meticulously described, often with an almost scientific precision, grounding the supernatural elements in a sense of reality. This detailed attention to setting and atmosphere serves to immerse the reader fully in Lovecraft's world, creating a palpable sense of place that heightens the psychological impact of the horror. The oppressive, decaying environments mirror the psychological state of Lovecraft's characters, who are often grappling with their own mental deterioration as they uncover the horrifying truths of the cosmos. First-person narration is another powerful tool in Lovecraft's storytelling arsenal. By telling his stories from the perspective of a single character, often an investigator or scholar, Lovecraft creates an intimate connection between the reader and the protagonist. This perspective allows the reader to experience the character's descent into madness and the existential dread firsthand. In The Call of Cthulhu, for example, the story is presented through the fragmented accounts of different characters, pieced together by the protagonist, Francis Wayland Thurston. This narrative structure not only builds suspense, but also allows the reader to experience the growing sense of dread and inevitability as Thurston uncovers the horrifying reality of Cthulhu and the cult that worships it. The theme of isolation is prevalent in Lovecraft's work, both physical and psychological. His protagonists are often loners, scholars, or investigators who are separated from society, either by choice or circumstance. This isolation amplifies their sense of vulnerability and helplessness in the face of cosmic horrors. In The Shadow over Innsmouth, the protagonist's journey to the decaying town of Innsmouth is marked by a growing sense of alienation and dread, culminating in his realization of his own horrifying connection to the town's monstrous inhabitants. Lovecraft also frequently explores the theme of madness, a common psychological horror trope. His characters encounter knowledge or beings that shatter their sanity, reflecting Lovecraft's own philosophical views on the limits of human understanding. In At the Mountains of Madness, the expedition members gradually lose their minds as they uncover the ancient, horrifying secrets of the Antarctic ruins. This descent into madness is often portrayed as an inevitable consequence of seeking forbidden knowledge, reinforcing the theme of the dangers of intellectual hubris. Lovecraft's use of forbidden knowledge as a narrative device is another key aspect of his psychological storytelling. This theme is particularly evident in the Dunwich Horror, where the protagonist, Dr. Armitage, discovers the horrifying result of a sorcerer's attempt to summon an ancient otherworldly entity. This whole idea, this concept of forbidden knowledge, it taps again into that deep-seated fear that we have of the unknown and the unknowable, as well as the consequences of overstepping human boundaries. Lovecraft stories often suggest that there are things in the universe that humanity is not meant to understand, and that seeking this knowledge can lead to madness and destruction. On top of all of these narrative techniques that we've discussed, Lovecraft's use of language plays a crucial role in his psychological storytelling. And you're going to see how this works as we get towards the end of the episode. And I give you a reading of a short story of his. We're not going to read the whole book. Don't panic. And you can see how that language works. I'll give you an example. You'll see that his prose is dense and elaborate, often filled with archaic and scientific terminology. And it's this style that serves to create a sense of authenticity and credibility, grounding the fantastical elements of his stories into a framework that feels real and plausible. The use of elaborate language also contributes to the atmosphere of the stories, which creates a sense of otherworldliness and alienation. His depiction of ancient, incomprehensible beings is another pinnacle point of his psychological horror. The great old ones, such as Cthulhu, Yog-Sothoth, and Nyarlathotep, I'm trying to pronounce these correctly, are entities that exist beyond the realm Nyarlathotep are entities that exist beyond the realms of human understanding. I'm sure you've all seen Cthulhu, the great tentacle-faced being. He looks a bit like that squid pirate from Pirates of the Caribbean, but just a lot bigger and much more terrifying and ominous. Their very existence challenges the protagonist's and by extension the reader's perception of reality. The idea that these beings have existed for eons and will continue to exist long after humanity is gone reinforces that theme of our cosmic insignificance. The impact of his horror is also heightened by his frequent use of dreams and visions. Many of his protagonists experience vivid, often disturbing dreams that provide glimpses into the cosmic horrors that lie beyond human perception. In The Shadow Out of Time, the protagonist, Nathaniel Wingate Peaslee, they've got some great names in these books. Nathaniel Wingate Peaslee experiences a series of dreams that reveal his mind has been swapped with that of an ancient alien entity, allowing him to glimpse the alien's experiences and knowledge. These dream sequences serve to blur the lines between reality and imagination, which heightens that sense of unease and this general disorientation that I feel comes with Lovecraft stories. They also reflect a lot of Lovecraft's interest in the subconscious mind and the ways in which it can be influenced by forces beyond our control. We only have to go back to the previous episode on consumerism, where we can see how the mind is subverted by external forces. Lovecraft stories also frequently explore themes of cultural and racial otherness, although it's important to acknowledge at this point that his views on race were deeply problematic and reflective of the prejudices of his time. So these themes, they are controversial, but they contribute to that sense of alienation and fear of the unknown that permeates his work. So, for example, if you look at The Shadow over Innsmouth, the protagonist, spoiler alert, just saying, big spoiler alert, cover thine ears if thine does not want to listen. The protagonist's horror at discovering his own connection to the monstrous inhabitants of Innsmouth does reflect Lovecraft's fears of cultural mixing. There's a lot of his own prejudice and his own fear and bias comes into that sense of the other in his storytelling. In conclusion, H.P. Lovecraft's psychological tools and methodologies in storytelling are integral to the lasting impact of his work. By leveraging the fear of the unknown, by creating immersive and atmospheric settings, utilizing first-person narration, and exploring themes of isolation, madness, and forbidden knowledge, Lovecraft creates a unique and enduring form of horror that continues to both captivate and terrify readers today. That wouldn't be the observing eye, would it, if I didn't get philosophical at some point? So we're going to spend a bit of time in this section exploring how Lovecraft infused some of his own philosophical ideas into his work and how they challenged the traditional notions of reality, existence, and humanity's place in the universe. At the heart of Lovecraft's philosophy is something called cosmicism, which is a worldview that emphasizes the insignificance of humanity in the grand scheme of the cosmos. Lovecraft's cosmicism posits that the universe is vast, ancient, and indifferent to human existence. And it's this perspective that challenges the anthropocentric view that humans are the center of the universe and have a special privileged place within it. Cosmicism is vividly illustrated in stories like The Call of Cthulhu, where we come across those ancient beings who predate humanity and whose motives and their very nature are beyond human comprehension. Cthulhu himself is a godlike entity that lies dormant beneath the ocean, just waiting to awaken and reclaim his dominion over the earth. And it's this sense of an ancient, indifferent cosmos that's a recurring theme in Lovecraft's work. And it's that plays into this whole sense of existential dread that you'll get from all of his writing. Lovecraft's cosmic horror also engages deeply with existential and nihilistic themes. His characters often confront the meaninglessness and purposelessness of existence in a vast, indifferent universe. This confrontation with the absurdity of existence is a key aspect of existential philosophy, which explores how individuals find meaning and cope with the inherent meaninglessness of life. And if you're interested in exploring some of those existential and absurdist themes, there is an episode from earlier this year where I looked at Albert Camus and the existential movement, and there's a whole episode all about absurdism, which I will link in the show notes if I can remember to do so, and you can go back and listen to that if you are so inclined. Now, it's interesting to note that whilst Lovecraft is attributed to coming up with this idea of cosmicism, we can see these sorts of ideas reflected in both Buddhist and Stoic sort of perspectives from way back when. So there are three ideas from each that I'm going to take, and we can look at how, Buddhism and Stoicism is reflected in some of these things that Lovecraft talks about. So from Buddhism, first of all, we have this idea called anicca, which is impermanence. And this is where Buddhism emphasizes the impermanence of all things, which includes human life and relationships and possessions and even the universe itself. And this realization from a Buddhist perspective can lead to a sense of cosmic insignificance and detachment from worldly concerns. So we can see how that kind of echoes in cosmicism's ideas. We then have this notion called anatta, which is no self. And this is where Buddhism rejects the notion of a permanent, unchanging self or soul, and instead emphasizes the interconnectedness of all things and the illusory nature of individual identity. Now, this idea can create a sense of cosmic unity and a recognition of the insignificance of the individual concerns in the grand scheme of the universe. And then lastly, we have dukkha, which is suffering. And in this, Buddhism acknowledges the universality of suffering and its roots in attachment, aversion, and ignorance. The whole acceptance of suffering as an inherent part of existence can lead to a sense of cosmic disillusionment and a recognition of the futility of seeking lasting happiness in a transient world. Now, from a Stoic sort of perspective, we have three more things. And that is amor fati, which I've talked about before, which is love of fate. And this is where Stoicism encourages us to accept our fate and the events of life, both good and bad, as part of a larger cosmic order. And that's kind of, in that we create a sense of cosmic resignation, a recognition of the futility of resisting the inevitable. So all of these things, they push back against this notion of human hubris, which I think is important. And it is another pivotal aspect of, pivotal, is that the right word? Pinnacle aspect of some of the ideas you'll see in Lovecraft's writing, some of those philosophical ideas around human ego and just squashing that down really hard with a giant demonic foot. Seems to be how that works. Then we have apatheia, which is equanimity. And in Stoicism, there is an advocation for cultivating emotional detachment from external events and focusing on what is within our own control. Now, this equanimity can lead to a sense of cosmic indifference, again, because we are recognizing the insignificance of external circumstances in determining one's well-being. It is down to us to determine our own well-being. That is one of the the ideas of it. And then lastly, this is one that you've all probably heard of, and it's memento mori, which is remember that you are going to die. And that is not from a maudlin, morbid sense, but it's about reminding ourselves that death is inevitable and that life is brief. And we, in doing that, in recognizing that, we can place some importance on living a virtuous life in the face of the unknown, essentially. So that's some of those ideas. So we've got Buddhism, we've got Stoicism influencing the ideas of cosmicism that appears in Lovecraft's work. And in that we see the insignificance of human concern, the importance of cultivating detachment from worldly desires and anxieties. Although obviously their doctrines and their practices are different, both of these traditions give us insights into the state of the human condition in relation to its place in the cosmos. In The Whisperer in Darkness, the protagonist's encounter with alien beings who have transcended physical form challenges his understanding of reality and his place in it. The story reflects Lovecraft's nihilistic view that the universe is indifferent to human concerns and that human existence has no inherent meaning or purpose. And this again comes back to that fundamental challenge of anthropocentrism. We see in his stories how he will often depict humans as insignificant and powerless in the face of these ancient cosmic forces. And it's this anti-anthropocentric, God, I've said this so many times without fluffing it, this anti-anthropocentric perspective, which is a real tenet of Lovecraft's philosophy. And it's a huge element in this whole cosmic horror thing. So in like the Dunwich horror, the protagonist confronts an ancient otherworldly entity that threatens to obliterate humanity. And this story emphasizes the fragility and insignificance of human existence. And again, comes into that anti-anthropocentric idea where, we're just like little tiny ants in the cosmic scheme of things. You'll see it in a lot of his stories. This whole anti-anthropocentric stuff comes up. It's pretty cool. Of course, Lovecraft stories also explore this idea of the unknowable, and the unknowable is his emphasis on the limits of human understanding and the dangers of forbidden knowledge. So there's a lot of that. I think this comes a lot with the time. If you look at the sort of 1920s and the whole like scientific explosion that was happening back then, and it was like there was like industrialization at a mad scale. You had like cars were coming in. People had just when did the Wright brothers make the first airplane? Was it like the 1900 something, wasn't it? It was I don't remember the exact year, but you've got this technological explosion happening, and then you've had like a huge world war. The first one, obviously, and everything must have seemed crazy and just going forward so quickly from what they had before. And there was a real kind of optimism around advancement and what humanity could do. I feel like Lovecraft was really pushing back against that and being like, hang on, guys, check your hubris a little bit. We aren't really, we are not masters of the universe. We are just monkeys with wrenches. So there's a lot of that, remember your place. So to summarize this little section, we can see that Lovecraft's works are rich with philosophical ideas that challenge traditional notions of reality, existence, and humanity's place in the universe. His cosmicism, materialism, and anti-anthropocentric views create a sense of existential dread and humility in the face of a vast indifferent cosmos. Through his exploration of the unknowable, the limits of human understanding, and the themes of alienation and isolation, Lovecraft uses philosophy in a very effective way to create this cosmic horror. Now, our last section, I'm going to give you an example of Lovecraft's writing, and I'm going to read the short story Dagon by Lovecraft. And I want to give you this as a So you can get a feel for his style. You can take the stuff that we've talked about already, and you should be able to identify some of these ideas that are used in the writing, some of those psychological techniques. You can see some of that philosophy coming through. And I'm hoping you just get a sense of existential dread and terror, and your hubris evaporates into the indifferent universe, basically. That's the idea of this. Well, clearly not so harsh, but you get the understanding. Okay. Get comfortable, everybody, as I read H.P. Lovecraft's Dagon. I am writing this under an appreciable mental strain, since by tonight I shall be no more. Penniless, and at the end of my supply of the drug which alone makes life endurable, I can bear the torture no longer, and shall cast myself from this garret window into the squalid street below. Do not think from my slavery to morphine that I am a weakling or a degenerate. When you have read these hastily scrawled pages, you may guess, though never fully realize, why it is that I must have forgetfulness or death. It was in one of the most open and least frequented parts of the broad Pacific that the packet of which I was supercargo fell a victim to the German sea raider. The Great War was then at its very beginning, and the ocean forces of the Hun had not completely sunk to their later degradation, so that our vessel was made a legitimate prize, whilst we, of her crew, were treated with all the fairness and consideration due us as naval prisoners. So liberal indeed was the discipline of our captors that 5 days after we were taken, I managed to escape alone in a small boat with water and provisions for a good length of time. When I finally found myself adrift and free, I had but little idea of my surroundings. Never a competent navigator, I could only guess vaguely by the sun and stars that I was somewhat south of the equator. Of the longitude I knew nothing, and no island or coastline was in sight. The weather kept fair, and for uncounted days I drifted aimlessly beneath the scorching sun, waiting either for some passing ship or to be cast on the shores of some habitable land. But neither ship nor land appeared, and I began to despair in my solitude upon the heaving vastness of unbroken blue. The change happened whilst I slept. Its details I shall never know, for my slumber, though troubled and dream-infested, was continuous. When at last I awaked, it was to discover myself half sucked into a slimy expanse of hellish black mire which extended about me in monotonous undulations as far as I could see, and in which my boat lay grounded some distance away. Though one might well imagine that my first sensation would be of wonder at so prodigious and unexpected a transformation of scenery, I was, in reality, more horrified than astonished, for there was in the air and in the rotting soil a sinister quality which chilled me to the very core. The region was putrid with the carcasses of decaying fish and of other less describable things which I saw protruding from the nasty mud of the unending plain. Perhaps I should not hope to convey in mere words the unutterable hideousness that can dwell in absolute silence and barren immensity. There was nothing within hearing, and nothing in sight save a vast reach of black slime, yet the very completeness of the stillness and the homogeneity of the landscape oppressed me with a nauseating fear. The sun was blazing down from a sky which seemed to me almost black in its cloudless cruelty, as though reflecting the inky marsh beneath my feet. As I crawled into the stranded boat, I realized that only one theory could explain my position. Through some unprecedented volcanic upheaval, a portion of the ocean floor must have been thrown to the surface, exposing regions which for innumerable millions of years had lain hidden under unfathomable watery depths. So great was the extent of the new land which had risen beneath me that I could not detect the faintest noise of the surging ocean, strain my ears as I might, nor were there any seafowl to prey upon the dead things. For several hours I sat thinking or brooding in the boat which lay upon its side and offered a slight shade as the sun moved across the heavens. As the day progressed, the ground lost some of its stickiness and seemed likely to dry sufficiently for travelling purposes in a short time. That night I slept but little, and the next day I made for myself a pack containing food and water, preparatory to an overland journey in search of the vanished sea and possible rescue. On the third morning I found the soil dry enough to walk upon with ease. The odour of the fish was maddening, but I was too much concerned with graver things to mind so slight an evil, and set out boldly for an unknown goal. All day I forged steadily westward, guided by a faraway hummock which rose higher than any other elevation on the rolling desert. That night I encamped, and on the following day still travelled toward the hummock, though that object seemed scarcely nearer than when I had first espied it. By the fourth evening I attained the base of the mound, which turned out to be much higher than it had appeared from a distance, an intervening valley setting it out in sharper relief from the general surface. Too weary to ascend, I slept in the shadow of the hill. I know not why my dreams were so wild that night, but ere the waning and fantastically gibbous moon had risen far above the eastern plain, I was awake in a cold perspiration, determined to sleep no more. Such visions as I had experienced were too much for me to endure again, and in the glow of the moon I saw how unwise I had been to travel by day. Without the glare of the parching sun, my journey would have cost me less energy. Indeed, I now felt quite able to perform the ascent which had deterred me at sunset. Picking up my pack, I started for the crest of the eminence. I have said that the unbroken monotony of the rolling plain was a source of vague horror to me, but I think my horror was greater when I gained the summit of the mound and looked down the other side into an immeasurable pit or canyon, whose black recesses the moon had not yet soared high enough to illumine. I felt myself on the edge of the world, peering over the rim into a fathomless chaos of eternal night. Through my terror ran curious reminiscences of Paradise Lost and of Satan's hideous climb through the unfashioned realms of darkness. As the moon climbed higher in the sky, I began to see that the slopes of the valley were not quite so perpendicular as I had imagined. Ledges and outcroppings of rock afforded fairly easy footholds for a descent, whilst after a drop of a few hundred feet, the declivity became very gradual. Urged on by an impulse which I cannot definitely analyse, I scrambled with difficulty down the rocks and stood on the gentler slope beneath, gazing into the Stygian deeps where no light had yet penetrated. All at once my attention was captured by a vast and singular object on the opposite slope, which rose steeply about 100 yards ahead of me, an object that gleamed whitely in the newly bestowed rays of the ascending moon. That it was merely a gigantic piece of stone, I soon assured myself, but I was conscious of a distinct impression that its contour and position were not altogether the work of nature. A closer scrutiny filled me with sensations I cannot express, for despite its enormous magnitude and its position in an abyss which had yawned at the bottom of the sea since the world was young, I perceived beyond a doubt that the strange object was a well-shaped monolith, whose massive bulk had known the workmanship and perhaps the worship of living and thinking creatures. Dazed and frightened, yet not without a certain thrill of the scientist's or archaeologist's delight, I examined my surroundings more closely. The moon, now near the zenith, shone weirdly and vividly above the towering steeps that hemmed in the chasm, and revealed the fact that a far-flung body of water flowed at the bottom, winding out of sight in both directions, and almost lapping my feet as I stood on the slope. Across the chasm, the wavelets washed the base of the cyclopean monolith, on whose surface I could now trace both inscriptions and crude sculptures. The writing was in a system of hieroglyphics unknown to me and unlike anything I had ever seen in books, consisting for the most part of conventionalized aquatic symbols such as fishes, eels, octopi, crustaceans, mollusks, whales, and the like. Several characters obviously represented marine things which are unknown to the modern world, but whose decomposing forms I had observed on the ocean-risen plain. It was the pictorial carving, however, that did most to hold me spellbound. Plainly visible across the intervening water, an account of their enormous size, were an array of bas-reliefs whose subjects would have excited the envy of a Doré. I think that these things were supposed to depict men, at least a certain sort of men, though the creatures were shewn disporting like fishes in the waters of some marine grotto, or paying homage at some monolithic shrine which appeared to be under waves as well. Of their faces and forms I dare not speak in detail, for the mere remembrance makes me grow faint. Grotesque beyond the imagination of a Poe or a Bulwer, they were damnably human in general outline, despite webbed hands and feet, shockingly wide and flabby lips, glossy, bulging eyes, and other features less pleasant to recall. Curiously enough, they seemed to have been chiseled badly out of proportion with their scenic background, for one of the creatures was shewn in the act of killing a whale, represented as but little larger than himself. I remarked, as I say, their grotesqueness and strange size, but in a moment decided that they were merely the imaginary gods of some primitive fishing or seafaring tribe, some tribe whose last descendants had perished eras before the first ancestor of the Piltdown or Neanderthal man was born. Awestruck at this unexpected glimpse into a past beyond the conception of the most daring anthropologist, I stood musing whilst the moon cast queer reflections on the silent channel before me. Then suddenly I saw it. With only a slight churning to mark its rise to the surface, the thing slid into view above the dark waters. Vast, Polyphemus-like and loathsome, it darted like a stupendous monster of nightmares to the monolith, about which it flung its gigantic scaly arms, the while it bowed its hideous head and gave vent to certain measured sounds. I think I went mad then. Of my frantic ascent of the slope and cliff, and of my delirious journey back to the stranded boat, I remember little. I believe I sang a great deal, and laughed oddly when I was unable to sing. I have indistinct recollections of a great storm some time after I reached the boat, at any rate. I know that I heard peals of thunder and other tones which nature utters only in her wildest moods. When I came out of the shadows, I was in a San Francisco hospital, brought thither by the captain of the American ship which had picked up my boat in mid-ocean. In my delirium I had said much, but found that my words had been given scant attention. Of any land upheaval in the Pacific, my rescuers knew nothing, nor did I deem it necessary to insist upon a thing which I knew they could not believe. Once I sought out a celebrated ethnologist and amused him with peculiar questions regarding the ancient Philistine legend of Dagon the fish god, but soon perceiving that he was hopelessly conventional, I did not press my inquiries. It is at night, especially when the moon is gibbous and waning, that I see the thing. I tried morphine, but the drug has given only transient surcease and has drawn me into its clutches as a hopeless slave. So now I am to end it all, having written a full account for the information or the contemptuous amusement of my fellow men. Often I ask myself if it could not all have been a pure phantasm, a mere freak of fever as I lay sun-stricken and raving in the open boat after my escape from the German man of war. This I ask myself, but ever does there come before me a hideously vivid vision in reply. I cannot think of the deep sea without shuddering at the nameless things that may at this very moment be crawling and floundering on its slimy bed, worshipping their ancient stone idols and carving their own detestable likenesses on submarine obelisks of water-soaked granite. I dream of a day when they may rise above the billows to drag down in their reeking talons the remnants of puny, war-exhausted mankind. Of a day when the lands shall sink and the dark ocean floor shall ascend amidst a universal pandemonium. The end is near. I hear a noise at the door as of some immense slippery body lumbering against it. It shall not find me. God, that hand! The window! The window! And that, ladies and gentlemen, is all I have to say on the subject of cosmic horror and the psychology of H.P. Lovecraft. As we come to the end of this episode, I want to take a moment to reflect on the journey that we've taken through the mind and works of H.P. Lovecraft. We've explored his background, delved into the psychological tools and methodologies he used in his storytelling, and examined the philosophical ideas that underpin his cosmic horror. Lovecraft's influence on the horror genre is undeniable, and his exploration of existential dread, the unknown, and humanity's insignificance continues to resonate with audiences today. Lovecraft's stories are not just tales of horror, they are profound explorations of the human condition and our place in the universe. His ability to evoke a sense of cosmic horror, to make us feel the vast, uncaring nature of the universe, is what sets his work apart and ensures its enduring popularity. By tapping into our deepest fears and existential anxieties, Lovecraft creates a form of horror that is both timeless and deeply psychological. Throughout this episode, we've seen how Lovecraft's background and personal experiences influence his writing. His materialist and atheist worldview, his fascination with the unknown, and his feelings of alienation and isolation all find expression in his stories. And with our taster of his work in the story Dagon, we capture the essence of Lovecraft's cosmic horror, with its vivid descriptions, atmospheric setting, and the overwhelming sense of dread that comes from encountering something utterly alien and beyond human understanding. I hope you enjoyed the story and found it as chilling and thought-provoking as I did. As always, I want to thank each and every one of you for spending your time with me today. Your presence, your attention, your focus is all deeply appreciated. I hope, as always, that there is something that you can take away from this episode that is useful or interesting or has made you think about something a little differently. Of course, if anything in this episode has resonated with you in any way, then I would love to hear from you. You can share your stories with us on Patreon at patreon.com/theobservingeye or on social media. You can find us on YouTube at youtube.com/@theobservingeye and on TikTok and Instagram with the handle @theobservingeye as well. Take care, everybody. Much love, and I'll catch you soon.
You've been listening to The Observing Eye. Thanks for spending some time with me today. I hope it's been useful. And if you're interested in any more of my writing or work around psychology, philosophy, and general day-to-day living, please go and take a look at my Substack, which is theobservingeye.com. And that's I as in the letter, not I as in the gelatinous organ through which you see. Take care, everybody. Much love, and I'll catch you soon.